My name is Mirai Tanaka. I'm 28 years old, and if you had asked anyone who knew me a month ago to describe my life, they probably would have called it predictable. I worked as a cybersecurity analyst in Seattle, spending most of my days investigating digital fraud, tracing stolen identities, and helping businesses recover from sophisticated cyberattacks. My career taught me to question everything on a screen, but ironically, I never imagined I'd one day fail to question a message that would nearly destroy my own family. My parents lived about 4 hours away on a quiet vineyard in Oregon. They had built that place from nothing long before I was born. Every row of grapevines represented years of hard work, and every visit reminded me that they valued honesty above everything else. We weren't the kind of family that spoke dramatically. We solved problems by sitting together around the kitchen table, talking until everyone understood one another. There was another person who had been part of our lives for years. His name was Draven Solis. To most people, he was exactly the kind of attorney every successful family hoped to hire. Calm, intelligent, organized, and always dressed as though he had stepped out of a magazine. He handled legal matters for several families in the area, including ours. My parents trusted him with contracts, estate planning, and business paperwork. Whenever his name came up during dinner conversations, my father always described him as dependable. I never had a reason to disagree. Looking back now, that was probably my first mistake. At the time, I believed trust was something people earned through consistency. Draven had never given us any reason to question him. Every document arrived on time. Every legal issue seemed to disappear under his guidance. He was the last person anyone would suspect of causing harm. Life continued normally until one Friday morning. The previous evening had been completely ordinary. My mother had called me after dinner to ask whether I planned to visit during harvest season. We laughed about how terrible I still was at picking grapes without accidentally crushing them. My father interrupted the call only to remind me that he expected me to bring the coffee beans I always bought from my favorite cafe in Seattle. Nothing about that conversation suggested it would be our last normal one. The next morning began like every other workday. My alarm rang at 6. I made coffee. I checked overnight security reports from several clients. Then my phone vibrated. At exactly 6:14 a.m., a text message appeared from my parents' shared number. "We think it's best you step away for now." That was all. No explanation. No greeting. No signature. No love you. I stared at the screen for several seconds, reading the message over and over again. It didn't make sense. If my parents wanted space, they would have called me. If something serious had happened, they certainly wouldn't have reduced it to a single sentence. Still, I didn't want to push them if they genuinely needed time alone. So, I typed the only response that felt respectful. "Understood. I'll give you space. Love you both." I pressed send. The message showed as delivered almost immediately. I waited for a reply. Nothing came. I convinced myself they simply needed time. People go through difficult moments. Families have disagreements. Maybe there was something happening at the vineyard that they weren't ready to discuss. By lunchtime, I had checked my phone at least 20 times. Still nothing. That evening, I called. The phone rang. Then it went to voicemail. I left a short message. "Hey, it's me. Just checking in. Call me whenever you're ready." No response arrived that night. The next morning, I tried again. Voicemail. Sunday passed the same way. By Monday afternoon, concern had started replacing confusion. I called my aunt. She sounded oddly uncomfortable. "Oh, your parents mentioned they wanted some quiet time," she said carefully. I wouldn't worry too much. That answer only raised more questions. My parents had never announced quiet time to relatives before. Later that day, I emailed both of them. Within seconds, the message bounced back. Delivery failed. That had never happened before. Something wasn't adding up. Every instinct I had developed from years of investigating digital deception quietly began pushing against my attempts to stay calm. The text, the silence, the failed emails, the strange explanation from my aunt. Separately, each detail could have been innocent. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. For the first time since receiving that message, I stopped asking whether my parents wanted distance. Instead, I began asking a different question. What if they never sent that text at all? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the message replayed in my mind. We think it's best you step away for now. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that didn't belong to my parents. I kept remembering the way my mother always ended every text with a heart emoji, or at least a love you. My father usually added a joke, even if it was terrible. Neither of them had ever sent a message that sounded so cold. By Tuesday morning, I had made up my mind. If they truly wanted distance, they could tell me that in person. I packed an overnight bag, informed my manager that I would be working remotely for a few days, and started the 4-hour drive from Seattle to Oregon. The weather remained clear for most of the trip, but my thoughts grew darker with every mile. I kept inventing explanations. Maybe they were overwhelmed with the vineyard. Maybe one of them was sick. Maybe they were simply angry about something I had unknowingly said. Every possibility sounded more believable than complete silence. When I finally turned onto the narrow country road leading to the vineyard, everything looked normal. Workers were trimming vines. Delivery trucks were parked near the processing barn. The tasting room sign still hung outside the entrance. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had happened. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the silence even stranger. I parked near the main house and immediately noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Both of my parents' vehicles were sitting exactly where they always parked them. My father's old pickup truck still had dirt on the tires from the previous week's work. My mother's SUV hadn't moved either. If they had gone away, why would they leave both cars behind? I knocked on the front door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The curtains were open. The furniture was exactly where I remembered it. Coffee mugs still sat on the kitchen counter. A newspaper remained folded on the dining table. Nothing looked abandoned. It looked interrupted. One of the vineyard employees noticed me standing outside and walked over with an awkward smile.
His name was Gavin.
He had worked for my parents for nearly 6 years. "Hey, Mireille," he said. "Didn't know you were coming." I couldn't reach my parents. "Oh." He hesitated. "I heard they left for a vacation." "A vacation?" That's what everyone was told. I frowned. "Where did they go?" He scratched the back of his neck. "I'm not really sure." "When did they leave?" "I think about a week ago." "You think?" He looked embarrassed. "I wasn't here that morning." That answer only deepened my suspicion. My parents never disappeared without telling the staff who managed the vineyard. Harvest season required planning. Every employee depended on their instructions. Leaving without notice made absolutely no sense. I spent the next hour speaking with several workers. Every conversation sounded almost identical. "They're taking some time away." They wanted privacy. They left unexpectedly. No one could answer the simplest questions. Where had they gone? Who drove them? When would they return? Nobody knew, or nobody wanted to say. As I walked around the property, I noticed something else. The office door was locked. That wasn't unusual, but the security cameras mounted around the building had been turned in different directions. Instead of covering the driveway and storage buildings, 2 cameras were now pointed toward empty sections of fencing. Whoever adjusted them knew exactly what they were doing. I photographed everything with my phone. Old habit. Evidence first. Questions later. While checking the back entrance, I saw fresh tire tracks leading toward one of the equipment sheds. The tracks were much wider than the tractors normally used on the vineyard. Heavy machinery. Recent heavy machinery. Yet none of the workers mentioned construction. I followed the tracks until they disappeared near the storage buildings. The large metal doors were locked with a brand new chain. I had never seen that chain before. As I stood there trying to understand why part of my parents' property suddenly seemed off-limits, I heard someone call my name. "Mireille." I turned. Walking toward me with perfect confidence was Draven Solis. He wore a tailored navy suit despite the summer heat, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand. He smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "I'm sorry we had to meet under these circumstances," he said. Relief briefly washed over me. Finally, someone who would have answers. Since Draven handled nearly every legal matter for my parents, surely he knew where they were. I've been trying to reach them for days, I said. Do you know what's going on? His expression remained calm. I do. My heartbeat quickened. Then where are they? Instead of answering immediately, he opened his briefcase and carefully removed a thick envelope. I think, he said quietly, it's time we discuss the decisions your parents made before they left. He handed me the envelope. Across the front were the words, estate management documents. I suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that my visit to the vineyard was about to become something far more serious than a family misunderstanding. I looked down at the envelope without opening it. The paper felt unusually heavy in my hands, as if whatever was inside carried more than legal documents. Draven stood quietly in front of me, waiting with the patience of someone who believed he was completely in control. You should read them, he said. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside were several neatly organized folders containing contracts, financial statements, trust agreements, and what appeared to be official letters signed by both of my parents. The first page caught my attention immediately. It stated that effective immediately, all operational authority over the vineyard had been transferred into a private management trust. The trustee was listed as Draven Solis. I blinked several times before reading the page again. This has to be wrong. Draven remained calm. It isn't. My parents would never hand over their business without talking to me. They did talk about it, he replied. They simply chose not to involve you. His words hit harder than I expected. I forced myself to continue reading. Every signature looked authentic. Every page carried official seals. There were notarizations, witness signatures, even banking confirmations. Everything appeared legitimate. If someone had handed these documents to me during one of my cybersecurity investigations, I probably would have accepted them as genuine after an initial review. That realization frightened me. I looked directly at Draven. When exactly did they sign these? About 2 weeks ago. And where? At my office. Who witnessed it? He calmly pointed toward the signatures. Everything is documented. His confidence never changed. It wasn't the confidence of someone trying to convince me. It was the confidence of someone who expected the paperwork to speak for itself. I want to see my parents. I'm afraid that isn't possible right now. Why not? They've requested privacy. They've ignored every phone call. They changed their numbers. My emails bounced back. They asked that communication remain limited. Everything about his answers sounded prepared. Not emotional. Not personal. Prepared. I folded the documents and slipped them back into the envelope. I'm not signing anything. I didn't ask you to. Then why show me this? Because eventually you'll have to accept their decision. Accept. That word stayed with me. Not understand. Not discuss. Accept. I left without saying another word. Instead of driving back to Seattle immediately, I checked into a small motel about 15 minutes from the vineyard. I spread every document across the room's small table. For hours I examined every page. The formatting, the signatures, the dates, the legal references. Nothing stood out. Everything looked professionally prepared. Too professionally. By midnight my eyes hurt from staring at paperwork. Frustrated, I opened my laptop and enlarged high-resolution photos I had taken of each page. I compared the signatures against old birthday cards, holiday letters, and previous contracts my parents had signed over the years. The signatures matched almost perfectly. Almost. There was one tiny detail. My mother's signature always contained a slight upward stroke at the end of the final letter. On these new documents, the stroke ended perfectly flat. Less than 2 millimeters. Almost invisible. Most people would never notice. I couldn't stop looking at it. Was it simply natural variation? Or something else? I needed more evidence. The next morning I visited the county records office. Every filing connected to the trust had been properly submitted. Nothing unusual. The clerk even complimented how complete the paperwork was. After leaving the courthouse, I stopped at the local bank that handled many of my parents' business accounts. Because I wasn't an authorized account holder, they refused to discuss finances. That was expected. Still, one employee accidentally mentioned something before realizing she had said too much. The attorney handled everything personally. She immediately apologized and ended the conversation. Personally, most attorneys delegated routine filings to assistants. Why had Draven overseen every step himself? That afternoon I drove back toward the vineyard, but parked several hundred yards away instead of entering the property. From a distance, I watched employees come and go. Then I noticed something strange. Draven's car arrived again. He wasn't meeting clients. He wasn't carrying legal files. Instead, he walked directly toward the locked storage buildings behind the vineyard. He looked around before unlocking the gate. Only he went inside. No workers followed. Nearly 45 minutes later, he emerged empty-handed, locked everything again, and drove away. Lawyers don't usually spend nearly an hour alone inside agricultural storage buildings. At least, not without a reason. As I continued watching, another detail caught my attention. A security camera mounted above the storage entrance slowly rotated. Not toward the driveway. Toward the exact spot where I had parked. Someone knew I was watching. I started my engine immediately and drove away before anyone approached. Back at the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already being observed. I locked the door, closed the curtains, and checked my phone. One new voicemail had arrived. There was no caller ID. I pressed play. For several seconds, all I heard was static. Then a woman's voice whispered only 6 words. Mireille, don't trust the paperwork. The recording ended. I replayed it 5 times. The voice sounded hauntingly familiar. It sounded like my mother. I replayed the voicemail until I could almost predict every crackle of static before my mother's whisper. Mireille, don't trust the paperwork. The recording lasted less than 10 seconds. There was no background noise. No location data. No caller identification. Just her voice. Or, at least what sounded exactly like her voice. I immediately called the number that had supposedly left the voicemail. The automated system informed me that the number did not exist. I tried again. Same result. Whoever sent it had gone to great lengths to erase the source. Most people would have accepted the recording as proof. I couldn't. Audio could be manipulated. Voices could be cloned. I needed something more reliable. Back in Seattle, I contacted someone I trusted professionally. Her name was Nadia Vorin. We had worked together on several cybercrime investigations over the past 3 years. Nadia specialized in digital forensics and electronic evidence. If anyone could determine whether the voicemail was authentic, it was her. She agreed to meet me the following morning. I handed her my phone without saying much. She listened once, then again. Finally, she plugged the file into her forensic workstation. For nearly an hour, neither of us spoke. The only sounds in the room came from cooling fans and the occasional click of her keyboard. At last, she leaned back in her chair. The voice hasn't been generated by artificial intelligence. I looked at her. You're sure? As sure as I can be. Relief washed over me for only a moment. Then Nadia continued. But someone intentionally stripped almost all metadata before sending it. So, we can't trace it? Not directly. She enlarged the audio waveform. There is one interesting detail. She isolated several tiny sounds hidden beneath the static. At first I heard nothing unusual. Then she amplified them. A faint mechanical rhythm emerged. Click, pause, click, pause, click. I frowned. What is that? Nadia smiled slightly. Not what? She played the sound again. Where? I didn't understand. She opened a library of environmental recordings collected from previous forensic cases. One after another, she compared the hidden rhythm against elevators, train crossings, generators, industrial fans, and refrigeration systems. Finally, she stopped. There. The patterns matched almost perfectly. What am I looking at? Commercial wine refrigeration compressors. I stared at the screen. The vineyard. Exactly. If the recording was made near those refrigeration units, then my mother hadn't recorded the message from some distant vacation. She had been on the property, or very close to it. That realization changed everything. My parents hadn't disappeared voluntarily. Someone wanted everyone to believe they had. Nadia wasn't finished. I also checked the documents you photographed. She placed several enlarged pages beside one another. These signatures are genuine. I frowned, but something still feels wrong. Because you're looking at the signatures. She pointed to the paper itself. I'm looking at everything else. She highlighted microscopic differences between the documents. Some pages had been printed weeks apart. Others contained tiny alignment shifts invisible to the naked eye. The signatures had originally belonged to completely different documents. They had been digitally extracted, repositioned, and professionally reproduced onto new contracts. I stared at the comparison. They copied real signatures. Yes. They didn't forge them.
No.
They recycled them. Exactly. That explained why everything looked authentic. Because part of it actually was. Draven hadn't created fake signatures. He had stolen genuine ones. Only the documents themselves were false. My pulse quickened. Can we prove this? Nadia nodded slowly. If we find the original documents. That was easier said than done. Draven controlled nearly every legal file connected to my parents. Even if the originals still existed, they were probably locked away somewhere only he could access. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing every digital backup my parents had ever shared with me. Tax forms, insurance papers, business licenses, old estate plans. Hours passed. Nothing. Just as I was about to give up, I found a folder labeled Archive. Inside were scanned copies of miscellaneous paperwork dating back almost 8 years. One file immediately caught my attention. A routine vineyard insurance renewal. My mother's signature sat neatly at the bottom. I enlarged it. Then I enlarged the signature from Draven's trust agreement. They were identical. Not similar. Identical. Every curve. Every pen lift. Every tiny imperfection. No human being signs their name exactly the same way twice. I overlaid one image on top of the other. They matched perfectly. Draven hadn't simply reused her signature. He had copied the entire signature image pixel for pixel. It was the evidence we needed. Nadia quickly documented the comparison using forensic software.
This will hold up, she said.
But it's still only part of the story. She was right. We now knew the paperwork had been manipulated.
What we still didn't know was why.
If Draven only wanted control of the vineyard, there were easier ways to steal money. He had invested enormous effort into isolating my parents, misleading relatives, altering legal records, and controlling communication. There had to be something far more valuable than the vineyard itself. As we continued tracing financial records connected to the trust, Nadia suddenly stopped typing. She zoomed in on a recent payment made from one of Draven's corporate accounts. It wasn't sent to a construction company or a law firm. It had been wired to an environmental excavation contractor. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I broke the silence. Why would an attorney secretly hire excavation crews? Nadia slowly turned the monitor toward me. I think, she said quietly, your parents' land isn't what Draven wants. She pointed to the payment description. He wants what's buried underneath it. I couldn't stop staring at the payment records on Nadia's monitor. An environmental excavation contractor. Not a landscaping company. Not a construction crew. An environmental specialist. I looked at Nadia. Could this just be related to maintenance? She shook her head. Companies like this don't repair irrigation systems or plant vineyards. They're hired when someone expects to find contaminated soil or hazardous materials. The room suddenly felt smaller. If Draven had secretly hired environmental contractors, then everything we had uncovered, the fake legal documents, the isolation of my parents, the redirected communication, had never been about controlling the vineyard itself. The land was only part of the equation. Whatever lay beneath, it was worth risking everything. We need to know the history of that property, Nadia said. Within an hour, we were sitting inside the county archives office, surrounded by decades-old property maps, zoning applications, and environmental reports. Most of the files were ordinary. Ownership transfers, agricultural permits, tax assessments. Then Nadia found a faded survey map from more than 30 years earlier. The section where my parents' vineyard now stood had once belonged to a chemical processing company that shut down unexpectedly before the land was sold. There was almost no explanation, just a short note indicating that an environmental inspection had been deferred. Deferred. Not completed. I requested every document connected to that inspection. The archivist disappeared into a storage room. Several minutes later, she returned empty-handed. I'm sorry, she said. Those files are missing. Missing? She nodded. They should be here. Nadia and I exchanged a quick glance. Someone had already been searching. On the drive back toward the vineyard, neither of us spoke much. We were both thinking the same thing. If official environmental records had disappeared, someone had removed them intentionally. As evening approached, we parked on a quiet road overlooking the vineyard. From that distance, the rows of grapevines looked peaceful. Nothing suggested the property was hiding decades of secrets. Then headlights appeared. One truck, then another, then a third. None of them carried vineyard equipment. Each vehicle displayed the logo of the same environmental contractor listed in Draven's financial records. They're moving tonight, Nadia whispered. Through binoculars, we watched workers unload ground-penetrating radar equipment and surveying tools. This wasn't random maintenance. They knew exactly where they were going. Minutes later, another vehicle arrived. Draven stepped out. Even from a distance, I recognized his posture. He wasn't supervising legal paperwork anymore. He was directing excavation crews. Nadia quietly raised her camera and began recording everything. They're starting before sunrise, she said. They're trying to finish before anyone notices. My phone suddenly vibrated. Unknown number. I answered immediately.
Static.
Then breathing. Finally, a man's voice. If you care about your parents... The line went silent for a moment. Leave Oregon tonight. The call disconnected. I stared at the screen. No number. No traceable information. They know we're watching, Nadia said. I nodded. They've known for a while. We couldn't simply call the local police. At this point, we had evidence of document manipulation and suspicious financial transfers, but we still couldn't prove why Draven wanted the property. Without a clear motive, he could dismiss everything as a legal misunderstanding. We needed proof of what was buried underground. Nadia opened her laptop inside the car. If they're using ground-penetrating radar, they already know where to dig. She compared old satellite images with recent aerial photographs of the vineyard. One rectangular section near the oldest storage building stood out. For years, the grass there had grown unevenly. The soil color differed slightly from the surrounding land. Most people would never notice. To Nadia, it looked obvious. Disturbed ground, she said quietly. Years old. Can you estimate the size? She measured the area. Roughly 40 feet long. Far too large for ordinary agricultural work. Darkness settled across the valley. The excavation crews continued preparing equipment. Generators hummed. Floodlights illuminated the isolated section of land. Then something unexpected happened. Another vehicle entered the property at high speed. An old pickup truck. My father's pickup truck. It stopped so abruptly that dust filled the air. The driver's door flew open. My father climbed out.
He looked exhausted.
His clothes were wrinkled. His beard had grown longer than usual. But there was no mistaking him. He was alive. He immediately pointed at Draven and shouted something we couldn't hear from our position. Workers stopped moving. Several stepped backward. Draven approached him with both hands raised, speaking calmly as though trying to settle an argument. Instead, my father shoved a folder into Draven's chest. Loose papers scattered across the ground. Draven's calm expression disappeared for the first time. He looked genuinely shaken. What just happened? I whispered. Nadia had already lifted her camera again. I don't know.
She zoomed in.
But whatever your father brought, Draven wasn't expecting it. For a few seconds, neither Nadia nor I moved. We simply watched from a distance as papers scattered across the gravel road near the excavation site. Draven bent down, trying to gather them before anyone else could read what was written on the pages. My father wasn't trying to stop him. He was pointing toward the ground where the excavation equipment had been parked. Even from where we stood, I could tell this confrontation had nothing to do with the vineyard business anymore. It was about whatever had been hidden beneath the land for decades. We're going, I told Nadia. She nodded without hesitation. By the time we reached the property entrance, Several workers had already stepped away from the excavation area. None of them looked comfortable. Most seemed confused, as if they had accepted the job without knowing what they had actually been hired to uncover. My father spotted me first. Mireille. I ran toward him. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. We simply hugged each other. I hadn't realized how afraid I had been until that moment. I stepped back. Dad, where's Mom? She's safe. The words alone lifted a weight from my chest. Where is she? State investigators have her now. I stared at him. Investigators? He nodded. I finally convinced them something wasn't right. He explained everything as quickly as he could. Draven had invited my parents to what he described as a private legal retreat to review new estate planning documents. Instead, they had been isolated at a luxury wellness center several hours away. No locked doors. No physical threats. Just constant manipulation. Their phones had been replaced. Outgoing calls were monitored. They were repeatedly told that family members, including me, wanted nothing to do with them because of financial disagreements. At the same time, relatives back home were told that my parents wanted complete privacy. Everyone believed someone else. No one realized they were all being lied to. My father eventually became suspicious after noticing that every conversation seemed strangely controlled. He secretly borrowed a staff member's phone and contacted an old friend who worked in the county records office. That friend discovered unusual property filings connected to Draven. My father escaped the retreat early that morning. The folder he had thrown at Draven contained original contracts my parents had signed years earlier. Real contracts. The same documents from which Draven had copied their signatures. He had unknowingly carried the evidence that exposed the fraud. Before anyone could say another word, multiple vehicles entered the vineyard. This time they weren't contractors. They belonged to the state environmental agency, county investigators, and federal financial crime officers. Someone had moved much faster than I expected. Nadia quietly smiled beside me. I submitted everything yesterday. You what? After confirming the document fraud. She shrugged. I wasn't going to wait. The lead investigator approached Draven and requested immediate access to every excavation permit, financial record, and legal authorization connected to the property. Draven tried to remain composed. He insisted everything had been approved. Then one investigator held up a forensic report prepared by Nadia. The comparison of my mother's original signature against the copied version appeared on the front page. Pixel for pixel. There was no explanation that could erase it. Another team activated ground-penetrating radar across the section of land where the contractors had been preparing to dig. Within minutes, buried anomalies appeared beneath the soil. A controlled excavation began. Several hours later, workers uncovered dozens of sealed industrial chemical containers buried decades earlier. Environmental experts immediately declared the area hazardous. Historical records later revealed that the waste had been illegally buried before the property was ever sold. Draven had represented one of the corporations secretly connected to the original dumping operation. If investigators discovered the containers, the company would face enormous financial penalties and criminal investigations. That had been his true motivation from the beginning. He never wanted the vineyard. He wanted unrestricted access to the land long enough to remove the evidence before government inspectors found it. Everything else had simply been a distraction. The fake text, the isolation, the forged legal documents, the lies told to our relatives. Every step had one purpose. Keep my parents away. Keep me away. Keep everyone away until the evidence disappeared forever. Instead, his own plan collapsed under the weight of the truth. Over the following months, Draven was charged with fraud, conspiracy, identity fraud, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. His law license was permanently revoked. The corporations that financed him became the focus of major environmental investigations. Several executives resigned before criminal charges were even announced. The vineyard remained closed while specialists safely removed the hazardous waste. The process took nearly a year. When it finally reopened, my parents held a small gathering for family, employees, and neighbors. No reporters. No speeches. Just people who had stood by one another after everything had fallen apart. My mother hugged me longer than she ever had before. I'm sorry you received that message. I smiled. I almost believed it. So did we. That was perhaps the hardest lesson of all. A single text message had nearly convinced an entire family to stop trusting one another. Since then, we've made one simple promise. If something feels wrong, we don't rely on messages. We call. We visit. We make sure the person on the other side is truly the one speaking. Looking back now, I realize the story was never just about fraud or buried secrets. It was about how easily trust can be manipulated when people stop verifying the truth for themselves. If my instincts hadn't told me that one message felt different, if Nadia hadn't looked beyond what seemed obvious, if my father hadn't refused to accept the lies surrounding him, none of us would have discovered what was hidden beneath the vineyard. Sometimes the greatest deception isn't the forged document. It isn't the stolen signature. It isn't even the person everyone trusts. It's believing that silence always means someone chose to walk away. Thank you for reading my story. If you enjoyed this journey filled with mystery, family, and unexpected twists, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. I'd love to see you again in the next one.